Welcome to yet another lesson. This is a very interesting selection that you will get to experience, and definitely by an author whom you have met probably so many other times before. And starting by looking at the title of this selection, Straw into Gold. It should take your mind to some point. It should take you somewhere. In your mind, you should think, you should wonder, why such a title, Straw into Gold? It definitely have a meaning. It represents something that is not just something ordinary. So we will dig into knowing why the story has such a name and what is in this story. And discussing about the author, this story is by Sandra Cisneros. Sandra has written a lot, and she was born in 1954. There were not few in her family. There were 7 children. And being the only girl in that family, you can imagine how the situation was for her. She lived with boys. That's all she had in her family. And she had a very helping hand as she grew up. In fact, at some point, she helped other high school dropouts, counseling them, teaching them, just ensuring that they maintain school and they continue staying in school. And before I proceed to any other point in this story, I would like to remind you that if you're looking at this title as this story for the first time, you haven't seen it before, you haven't read it before, you might not be so prepared for this presentation. And it is at this point that I urge you to pause here. And in your booklet, you'll find the story. Straw into Gold is the name of the story. Go through the story, read the story, before you proceed with this presentation. It is going to give you a better picture once you do that. So, assuming you have read the story, by the time we proceed at this second point, Sandra Cisneros writes this autobiographical essay, and she calls it Straw into Gold, the Metamorphosis of the Everyday. And in this story, she tells her experiences in France. And at some point, she has hosts who want her to make tortillas, but she doesn't know how. And she goes on and she shares about her difficulties that she has experienced in the past. One, she had to leave her home. She had to leave where her family was living, and she had to go to college. And this was not something that was so common in her tradition, in her culture. And so, number one, we can imagine the challenges that come with that change, that a girl has left home and she has gone to college. And after that, she moved a lot. And so she did not have a permanent home. And it meant that she also had to make new friends everywhere she went. And she wasn't such an excellent student. She was good, but she wasn't excellent. And finally, she settled at her own home. And after having all these experiences, she became a very successful writer. And her writings seem to be based on her experiences. She writes things that relate directly to her experiences. Just like we've mentioned a few seconds ago, this is an autobiographical essay. And not just this story, just all her stories revolve around her cultural background, her personal experiences, how her family influenced her life. And in this quoted line by her, she says that her brothers also figured greatly in her art, especially the older two. She grew up in their shadows, just to show that she didn't just grow up, they really influenced her life and the way she grew up and the girl she grew up to be. And it is important that we analyze this selection deeper, literary meaning-wise, and just trying to wonder why she said the things she said and why the setup of the events of this story. And In this story, Straw into Gold, she says that when she was making tortillas, she felt helpless. In quote, why did I feel like the woman in the fairy tale who was locked in a room and ordered to spin straw into gold? Number one, it tells you that she wasn't able to do what she had been asked to do. And that is what triggered her feeling. What kind of feeling? Similar to that of a woman in that fairy tale. And what happened to this woman? She was locked in a room and she was ordered to spin straw into gold. And I know by now you're able to relate this with something outside the story. The relationship between what she has just mentioned and her experiences in this particular setup. And in this statement, we get to realize that she's alluding to the story of Rumpelstiltskin. I think you know that story. I think you know that fairy tale. And this style whereby an author takes something that we already know, it can be from another story, it can be from history, and tries to use it in their own story and makes a reference to it. It is called allusion. Allusion is the style here. So we can as well say that Sneros is using allusion when she brings in the situation of the woman in that fairy tale. And which fairy tale is this? This is the story of Rumpelstiltskin. And she makes this reference to Rumpelstiltskin because she wants us to understand how helpless she is. Again, the allusion to this story of Rumpelstiltskin is also used as a metaphor in her autobiographical essay. It is also a metaphor that is used in this story. In which way? She is comparing her experiences and the literary works. She turns those experiences into the straw that is spun into gold in the story of Rumpelstiltskin. So now we should be able to understand the metaphor. Remember, metaphor is when you compare two things. You compare two things indirectly. So here when she says that, look at her experiences and what she went through, and look at her literary work, and you realize that when she took those experiences into her hands, these were the straws. And what did she do with these straws? She spun them into gold. She spun those straws into gold. In which way? By turning her experiences into literary work, then it is actually similar to spinning straw into gold in the story of Rumpelstiltskin. Now, this is a popular story, and in previous assignments, I have asked you to go through it, read the story. It is a very interesting story if you would like to analyze it. And for the sake of straw into gold, Rumpelstiltskin is a fairy tale. In this fairy tale, we get to learn about a miller. This miller was very poor and he was very boastful. And he had a beautiful daughter, Lisa. Lisa was her name. And the miller lied to the king about Lisa. And when he went to the king, he told the king that actually Lisa could turn straw into gold. Now the king was very delightful. He was so happy, and he took Lisa to a room. The room was full of straw, and there was a spinning wheel in that room. And the king demanded to Lisa that she must turn all the straw that was in that room into gold in 3 days. If not, the king was going to kill her. He would have sentenced her to death. Now, of course, Lisa was very sad, and she would not have been able to grant the king's wishes. She knows that she cannot do what she's being asked to do. And just as she's having those terrible thoughts, a stranger appeared, came to this room and offered to help her. Now, this stranger, later on, we get to learn that he was Rumpelstiltskin, who was actually able to spin straw into gold. And when he offered to do that for Lisa, Lisa gave him her necklace and ring. And then the king became so greedy and he wanted more gold. And then the king again asked his servants to search for all the straw that they could find everywhere, so that they could all be taken, given to Lisa, and she would turn all of them into gold. And he again promised her that she would become his queen if she granted his wishes. Again, another threat for her was that he would cut off her head if she did not turn all those straws into gold. And she sat there, she was so sad and she was crying and she just didn't know how to do what she had been asked to do. And once more, Rumpelstiltskin appeared. This is the third time, and again offered to help her, but in promise that this was the last time. Now, Lisa had nothing to give this time in return. And Rumpelstiltskin spun all the straw into gold, and Lisa had no choice but to promise him that, look, after helping me all this, all I can promise you is to give my firstborn child after I become the queen. And fortunately or unfortunately, after 1 year, Lisa got a baby boy. Now, is she going to give this baby to Rumpelstiltskin just like the promise? And as expected, Rumpelstiltskin returned to claim his reward. And Lisa was very frightened. This time she's a queen, she's not just Lisa. And she tried to offer him all that she could. Of course, she had wealth by this time, and she tried to offer it to Rumpelstiltskin, just so that she could keep her child. And Rumpelstiltskin refused and finally agreed to give up his claim to the child on one condition. What was this condition? That if Lisa, the queen, could guess his name in 3 days. Of course, at first she tried so hard, she failed. But before the final night, they thought of something very creative. Her parents were able to follow Rumpelstiltskin to the woods, and as he was walking down, he started singing. And while he was singing, they listened very keenly, and they got to decipher what his name was from what he was singing. And that's how they discovered that his name was Rumpelstiltskin. Of course, the next morning he came to the queen, and she very smartly revealed his name. Of course, at this point, we understand that Rumpelstiltskin lost his bargain. He got so angry. He stamped the floor so hard, and suddenly, poof, he vanished. And some few lessons to be learned from this story. Lisa's father promised that he wouldn't be so boastful from here, because it taught him a very important lesson. But for us, what is important is that part where Lisa is actually asked by the king to spin straw into gold. It is impossible for her. She doesn't know how to do it. It is the same thing that happens to Sandra when she is actually asked to make tortillas. She doesn't know how to make tortillas. And actually, we get to know that she is requested to make the tortillas. She doesn't know how to make them. And yet she doesn't tell her hosts, she doesn't tell them that she actually doesn't know how to make them. And we start to wonder why. Why didn't Cisneros tell her hosts that she does not know how to make tortillas? And number one, it wouldn't have been so easy for her, because they expected her to know how to do it. And so we say that she feels embarrassed because she's a Mexican American who doesn't know a skill that so many other Mexicans know how to do. And again, she may have been raised in such a household that was so traditional in the way they raised the girl, that she was expected to stay quiet. She wasn't supposed to speak up. She's a girl. She doesn't need to speak so much. And so for these two reasons, we get to understand why she did not quickly tell them that, oh no, it's impossible to do what you're asking me to do. I cannot make tortillas, and I am sorry, I have no skill on that. She is embarrassed. And again, she might have been brought up like a traditional girl who must be quiet and not speak up so loudly. In one of her lines, she speaks and she says, somehow, my Latino hosts had gotten a hold of a packet of corn flour, and this is what they tossed my way with orders to produce tortillas. Así como si. Any old way. They said and went back to their cooking. This is a quote, and we are asked here, we ask ourselves, what does así como si mean? What does she mean? And why does she include this phrase when she writes? And from the context of this phrase, we understand that the meaning of the phrase is any old way. And this reminds us that, number one, her hosts are able to speak English. They're Spanish, they speak Spanish. And this also reveals that their assumptions actually were wrong. They did not give her a recipe. They expected her to know how to make tortillas maybe in so many forms, in so many ways, yet they don't ask her and they don't get, it's just a confirmation that actually what you expect me to do, I do not know how to do, so your assumption about what I'm able to do is wrong. And Cisneros describes in her writing, in her other book, that it's called The House of Mango Street, that she was a girl who couldn't come out of her shell. Listen to this expression that describes who she was, that a girl who couldn't come out of her shell. And this is direct characterization. It is direct characterization because she tells us exactly who she was. And this part of her essay, when she writes that, is very significant. It's very important because she is directly stating how she felt, and she categorizes herself. And in this period of her life, she was in search to find who she was. What type of person am I? What types of woman am I? So this is direct characterization. When somebody tells you directly who you are or tells you directly who they are, then we say that is direct characterization. You don't have to think. It is a line that directly takes you to who that person would like that thing or that person to be described as. That is direct characterization. And again, listen to this other line. As a young child in school, Cisneros was the girl in the picture with skinny arms and a crumpled skirt and crooked hair. She was the girl in the picture with skinny arms and a crumpled skirt and crooked hair. Now, we learn two things here. That she directly characterizes her looks because she's describing her clothes here, her hair, her arms. But again, that is not it. She is also implying that she didn't have the best clothes or she didn't have the best things. She's implying here that she didn't live in the best conditions. Even though her parents tried their best, she didn't live in the best conditions ever. So get to understand at what point do we call this indirect characterization is when you actually imply a meaning to a word or to a line. That it is indirect because it implies that now that she was dressed this way, it equally means that her life and what she was provided with was not necessarily the best, you know. And again, on the direct side, it is direct because immediately she tells us how her clothes were, how her hair was, how her arms were. That her arms were skinny, her skirt was crumpled, and her hair was crooked. That is direct. We don't need to think deeper about it. And as you read this story, I hope you kept to this idea that actually this is, she tells of how her ambition grew, how her ambition grew into something from what she was and all the way until she became the writer that she is. And in this autobiographical essay, the mood of this essay is ambition, because she describes her experiences and she's able to show how she is inspired to become something great, to improve herself and to become who she is. And it is meant actually to inspire the reader to do the same thing, to inspire you to see that you can come from a very low ground and you can rise into something. And the fact that she was able to do that, to turn every situation, to make the best out of it, is a message to the reader, to inspire the reader to try something better and finally great at the end. And this piece of writing, this autobiographical essay, is very important here because she is able to take us through her journey into becoming a great writer. Her childhood is her inspiration, and we know that because it has become so important that it has been translated again and again for the public just to have a feel of what she writes and what and in which ways she became a better person right from childhood. And in one of the descriptions, we get to understand that she is in an internal conflict because she did something that was not popular in her culture. She left behind her 6 brothers, and later on, looking at what she had done, she wondered if she was aware of having been already in a quiet war. You know, I don't know if you can just pause for a minute and wonder what that means. That now that she has left, and she doesn't just walk away and go, she realizes that, oh my goodness, this could be the beginning of a quiet war. That it's not something that somebody will verbalize so loudly or so quickly. It is something that is not acceptable. Girls don't leave home, and they don't leave before their brothers in her culture. And this is an example of an internal conflict. If you remember what it is actually that conflict, that force in you, or 2 forces inside that are pulling this way and pulling this way. It is a conflict within a person. She wants to go, she must leave her home, but she very well feels that it is not acceptable because inside her, she can remind herself that this is a quiet war that is about to begin because it is not something that is common. So it is a war in herself. The fact that she reminds herself and she tells herself that this is not what I expect to flow with very smoothly, it is a quiet war, this is an internal conflict. And like we have said, she broke a tradition of her culture. She should have waited until she was married, and then she would have left her family. And here she lives by herself. And this is what triggers the conflict in her and something that looks like it is wrong according to her culture. And I would like you to pause once again and ask yourself, what is the theme of this essay? What is the theme? What is this piece of writing about? The theme of this autobiographical essay is that of being able to change ordinary experiences into something great. Being able to change ordinary experiences into something great. Now, number 1, Sandra had moved with her family constantly when she was a child. So she didn't have a permanent home for so many years. After so many years, of course, her family got to settle. Now, again, it is this new home that filled her with so many experiences that inspired her to write her book, The House on Mango Street. Take your time, and if you ever get interested, read and see what she says. The House on Mango Street. And she turned ordinary experiences into a great literary work. Many of her struggles are what inspire her to write. And since she struggles with traditions of her culture, she features her culture in so many of her writings. It is tradition, it is the culture that influences most of her writings, and she writes so much about her culture. For example, she left her home before marriage, and this is a tradition that she breaks. It's not so popular. And by leaving, she opened so many opportunities for herself, and there she was becoming a very successful contemporary writer. And looking at the title of this selection, by now you're able to relate what the title refers us to. This title alludes to the story of Rumpelstiltskin. It shows how Cisneros took ordinary straw. Remember what we said straw was? Her experiences. And she spun it into gold. And what is this gold? Her great literary pieces of work, her writings. It tells us that she worked very hard and she took advantage of opportunities around her, and she became a better person. And looking at her Hispanic heritage and how it even means something today to us, I know you know these people, you know Christina Aguilera, and you know how successful she is in her career. A Hispanic person who just goes through so many challenges just to become successful. And again, another musician, Enrique Iglesias, a singer who is very successful, coming from very low levels of orientation, of childhood, of a society that is so different from your own culture, and coming all the way to acceptance and to success. And everybody wants to read your story, wants to touch the hem of your gown, wants to be where you are. And there goes the success story, similar to that of Sandra Cisneros. As per analysis of this story, we come to the end of that part of analysis. And all that is left for you at this point is to answer the applying your skills questions that appear at the end of your story. I assume that you followed my instructions at this point. I assume that you read the story. You paused at the point where you are supposed to pause just before you analyze the story. And you read the selection. And then the analysis took you into the details of the selection that are very important. And at this point, you're very familiar with the language. You're very familiar with the concept. By now, you know that Spanish language will feature a word here or there, just as a reminder that the people she was interacting with spoke the language. And by the time you reach this point, you should be very comfortable with this story. The good thing about it is that it's a presentation you can always replay. You can always go back to that point that is not very clear. You can note down a question for further discussion. And please answer the applying your skills questions in your copybook, and we will discuss them as usual in our next lesson. And having gone through the selection straw into gold, I hereby wish you all the best, and until next time, it is goodbye.